The next game we're going to look at in this classic game series is going to be the game between Rotlewi and Rubinstein. It was played in Tucson, 1907. Many players are familiar with this game, and actually, I think if you're a serious student of the game, you should know this game. This is one of the most fascinating tactical melees that I've seen on a chessboard, and it really shows Rubinstein's brilliance. If you look at his games overall, you go, well, what a stodgy player, but he had some really great moments of tactical brilliance, as you'll see in this game. But this game shows so many tactical themes that I think it's very important for a serious student of chess to look at it, find it in a database, and go through it. Not just watch this video, but actually set it up on a board and go through it yourself, because it's really fascinating, everything that's going on in it. Some may look at these games and think that the great masters just simply rolled over weak opposition. In a sense, that may be true, because back in the day of the Romantic era of chess, there was no ELO rating system or anything like that. But you did have to qualify via certain tournaments to qualify for bigger tournaments, such as Carlsbad or something like that. You gained your reputation by playing good chess and beating tough opponents, and they had no way of a finite number system to determine who masters were. It was mainly of who you had beaten, who you have lost to, and just a relative weight was given to your play. So some may think that these games that the great masters played, and which became classic games, was against very weak opposition. In some cases that may be true, such as Morphy against Count Isouard in Paris, but no one ever claimed that he was facing stiff opposition, yet that game is a classic game. Here we have Rubinstein playing the black pieces against Rotlewi, and now Gers Rotlewi, I think that's how you pronounce it, maybe Gers, G-E-R-S-Z. He was born in 1889 and he died in 1920. He was a Polish player, and his master level career began around the winter of 07-08. In 1906, he did tie for 5th and 6th place in Lodz. It was a tournament that Akiba Rubinstein had won. And in 1907, he took 3rd behind Rubinstein and Danishevsky, sorry. And this was also in Lodz. It was a quadrangular tournament. He played a match against Solvay in 1909, where he won 5 games, drew 3, but lost 8. And then in 1911, he played another match where he won 3, drew 6, and only lost 1. So he won the return match. In the All-Russian tournament, that was at St. Petersburg in 1909, he came in 2nd to Alekhine, and at Carlsbad, he came in 4th after Teichmann, Rubinstein, and Schlechter, but he was ahead of Marshall, Nimzovich, and Vidmar, and Alekhine and Duras, as a matter of fact. The promise of his rapid progress and the feeling for his really energetic play, it was not fulfilled. He was struck by a serious nervous illness, and he never played again. So he was no slouch. He was awarded a master title in 07, late 07. So he was not just a pushover. So we should see a good game on his part here. Akiba Rubinstein. Well, what can I say about this guy? He was a very, very strong grandmaster. He was born December 12th, 1882, and he died on 15th March, 1961. He was a Polish grandmaster. When he was a youngster, his family planned for him to become a rabbi, yet he didn't finish the studies, and he devoted himself to the game of chess after he won 5th place in the 1903 tournament in Kiev. He learned to play at the age of 16 and had been training with the strong master Salve in Lodz. I could go into a whole string of tournament victories that this man has had, and they're all fascinating, but it's too lengthy to give here and it would take up most of the video. Let's suffice it to say that Chessmetrics did a study on Rubinstein, and Chessmetrics is a program where you can go back to old players of the past and actually determine what their ratings are by working backwards from the rating system. And between 1912 and 1914, they placed Rubinstein as #1 in the world, and felt that he was stronger than the world champion Lasker at the time. Unfortunately, Lasker's financial demands were too high for Rubinstein to come up with the money to play him, and that's the way it was in those days, and that's a shame. Unfortunately, in St. Petersburg in 1914, he didn't even place in the top 5, so a match with Lasker wasn't going to take place after that. Rubinstein was a colorful character in chess history. There are many things written about him, and I can't even begin to touch it on him right here. He was a big student of the openings. He's got many lines named after him in the, well, of course, the Nimzo, the Queen's Gambit, and the Four Knights game. Many of those variations are still played today. After 1932, he withdrew from tournament play because of his schizophrenic tendencies. They were becoming prevalent, and he was suffering from anthropophobia, which is a fear of people and society. Now, Wikipedia says they need verification or on this. I can pretty much say if everything I read about the man is true, then this is probably so. According to other sources, he would be the type of person that would only come to the board when it was his turn to move. He would look at his move, make it, and then immediately get up and walk away. And he wasn't one to go socialize very often during this occurrence. He would go and stand by himself and watch and wait for his opponent to make a move. Then he'd come back to the table, make his move, and then depart once again. So that's kind of an odd behavior. So the comment in Wikipedia may well be true. Although he lived for almost another 30 years, he left behind no legacy in books or anything like that, which others have done, like Alekhine, which is a shame. And during World War II, when the Nazis eventually arrived to haul the aged Jewish grandmaster from his asylum to the death camps, he was so crazy that they gave up this attempt. So it's a sad ending to a remarkable player. How often do we see that happen? One more thing before we head on to the game itself. I have two sources. ChessBase gives it as Ostend 1906, and other sources in print where I've seen it most often it shows Lodz 1907. And so I'm going to leave it as Lodz. I think that was the place. It could be wrong, but that's not important. The game itself is important. So let's move on to the game. Welcome to the game Rotlewi versus Rubinstein, Lodz 1907. If you don't agree that it was Lodz, pause the video until you come around to my way of thinking. I'm not a historian of the game. I couldn't tell you. Maybe Ostend changed its name and that's why it's going to Lodz or whatever. Whatever the case may be. We want to look at this game. White was Rotlewi and Rubinstein was playing black. And we get into, I'm not going to cover the opening in any great detail because it's not that important to us. But quickly we arrive at a classical tirage, which is sort of a tabia in those days of an opening for the players. And it's interesting to see how black is able to get an advantage out of this opening. Bishop b2, castles, queen to d2. Now, this move in itself is not a mistake, and White's kind of in a bit of a quandary here. He wants to develop his king bishop, but if he does that, then black takes on c5, and the bishop has to move again. By black delaying this capture, keeping the tension in the center, he keeps the white queen from coming to probably the best spot, which would be e2. I don't know, c2 is probably good too. But Rubinstein played queen to e7. I'm sure that white would like to have the same kind of setup, but he has to move his bishop out of the way first. So he does that, and only now does black take on c4, forcing this bishop to use another move. And now b5, bishop goes back, now rook to d8. And this is typical of a lot of Rubinstein's games. If you look at him, you'll see he likes the symmetrical positions, but he likes to find these little nuances that is going to give him a lead in development. White now decided he wanted to go for a symmetrical type position, so he played queen to e2, and after bishop to b7, we have an interesting position. White starts the game, and yet, in order for him to get a truly symmetrical position here, he has to make two moves. He has to castle and bring his king rook to d1. Now, how did he get behind in this? When you're analyzing your own games, you'll want to look for, in your opening, tempo burners. And this can be in a sharp, aggressive opening, and it can be in a very positional opening. You'll always want to look for tempo burners. Where did I burn a tempo that I could have saved? In this case, it was kind of not really White's choice. Here, he wanted to play the bishop. Probably bringing the bishop out first would have saved one move at least. So let's say if he had gone bishop to d3, and then we take here, go here, bishop to d3, bishop e7, castles, queen to e7, queen to e2, rook to d8, and rook to d1. So here we would have a truly symmetrical position. The thing though is the advantage of the first move has slipped over to black, because black is actually on move here. But we can see that this move here, queen to d2, is probably what we would call a mistake, because it puts him down a whole move. And after queen to e2, bishop b7, we get to the current position that we're discussing here. So you do want to keep an eye out for tempo burners. And now, while we're on this idea of tempos, what can you do with tempos? As a matter of fact, what can you do in almost any chess position where you don't know entirely what to do? Well, I talked in previous videos how important it is to have a plan, but how do you get a plan? There's a system that I call the chess triad, and I'd like to explain it to you briefly here. There are basically four functions to this, or four elements to this triad. It's a triad plus one force, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But the triad, in its bare bones way of thinking, is it's material, space, and time. Now, it's easy to remember this, especially if you've seen the Comedy Central TV show series called Mystery Science Theater. MST is what everybody knew it as. So if you remember MST, you'll remember the triad: material, space, and time. So let's take the first item, material. If you're up in material, you want to consolidate. Okay? That's a very important rule, because a lot of times you get into the tactics and you say, I can win a pawn, or I can win the exchange. And then when you get done winning the pawn or the exchange, your pieces are out of place. So you consolidate. You bring the pieces back, you get them coordinated again, and then you go for the second phase of the plan, which is capitalizing on your material advantage. Okay, now the other item is space. If you are the side with more space, you want to retain your pieces, where appropriate. I mean, sometimes exchanges just flat out need to be made, but if you usually have the advantage in space, you want to maintain the pieces because you have more room to operate. Now, time is such a transient in nature, it does not last for the whole game. So you want to take advantage of your time, if you're heading tempo, or tempi, you want to attack. You want to be aggressive because you want to take that time advantage and convert it into either the space advantage or hopefully the material advantage, or both. So you have to act fast when you have the lead in development. Now there's a flip side to the triad. Let's go back to material. If you just went through complications and you lost material, you went through tactics and lost some material, you want to keep complicating the game. You don't want to make it easy for your opponent to consolidate. I do this a lot of times when I go into tactics. I go, well, I can get this, but how am I going to get out of it once I get that? So I often look at my tactics in that way. I'm going to go in there, I'm going to punch in to the center of the city, I'm going to grab whatever prisoners I need, and then I'm going to get out. If you don't pay attention to that getting out, the withdrawal phase of your actions, you're going to be often left with having to sacrifice something back in order to maintain a level game. So if you are down in material, you want to complicate. So with space, since the person with the space wants to hold on to pieces because he has room to maneuver, the best thing to do when you have a lack of space is to exchange pieces. Again, you don't want to exchange all of them. It's going to depend on the situation. But typically, if you are at a disadvantage in space, trading pieces will alleviate some of that because you'll have less pieces that you need to maneuver around in a tinier, smaller amount of space. With time, what you need to do with time disadvantage is to develop effectively. Now, Black did that earlier in the game. He saw that whenever White develops his bishop here, he's going to be able to take on c4 and cause that bishop to move a second time. So that's how you develop effectively. The last thing that you need to consider, it's not part of the triad, but it's a part of the equation of determining a chess position, and that is the one of force. Let's take this position here, and we see the rook on f8. It has its own intrinsic value of 5 points that everybody knows. Now, if we move that rook over to d8, it has more force because it's on an open file. I just realized that my mouse clicks are probably driving people batty there, so I'll stop doing that. So that's the basic triads. Now, in this position here, Rubinstein realizes that he's ahead in time. So what can he do? He's equal in space because it's symmetrical. How can anybody be at a disadvantage in a symmetrical position? So he's ahead in space. Maybe that's why he likes symmetrical positions, because all he had to worry about was time and force. White played queen to e2 and now bishop to b7. White wants to get caught up in development, so he castles. It's all normal. And now it is very, very instructive to see how Rubinstein handles this small advantage in time and converts it into a bigger plus in the other dimensions. He plays knight to e5. Now this is breaking the symmetry altogether. After knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, there is no way they can get a symmetrical position here. Okay, White plays f4 here, and the computers kind of agree with that. And then he drops the bishop back to c7, and then e4. I think rook a to d1 right away, and the idea of dropping the bishop back to b1 might be White's best hope, but I think he's still on the short end of the stick in this position. After e4, and we see White battling for part of that chess triad that we were talking about. And this is where the balance of the game is either A, a matter of taste, or B, the guy followed the wrong plan. in this case, by playing the pawn to e4, white is looking to gain space. It makes sense. Like I was saying earlier, if you don't have a plan, how do you develop a plan? I mean, you got to think of the triad. But in this case, gaining space may not have been the main thing to think about. Perhaps going with force with rook ad1 was really the way to go. Increasing the strength of the rook and nullifying the dominance of black in the center on the d file. That might have been, a little better for white instead of e4. But he didn't. He played e4, and he's trying to control the center and have more space. And then black brings his rook into a to c8. And now white continues with his plan of getting more space. And now black plays bishop to b6 with check. Very interesting position here. Now we're going to look at the force here. Look at the forces that black's pieces have. The bishops are what are commonly called Harwitz bishops or raking bishops, and the rooks just are like a double-barreled shotgun, just ready to come mowing down on the center files there, the C and D files. Additionally, if we look at white's camp, his knight and is blocking his bishop, and his light squared bishop really only has e4 square to go to. c2 and b1 are also there, but the key thing to look at is the d4 e4, the e3 f3, and the f2 g2 squares are deadly exposed to those raking bishops. So white is in check. He has to move. He plays king to h1, and now knight to g4. And all of a sudden, things are getting pretty complicated for white. Black's ready to bring the queen in. Threaten some nasty stuff here. What is white to do? One idea might be queen takes g4, but this is not so appetizing for white because if rook takes d3. Now if rook fd1, then we trade two pieces for the rook. And if he tries to get cute and play rook d6, getting materialistic, then black has a really nice move, bishop d5. And the point is, if white tries to win the bishop here, he's in trouble. He loses a piece after queen to c7 because mate on c1 is threatened and the rook on b6 is threatened. So here, I think that black would probably look to just do something like bishop to here, maybe rook to here, and just solidify, bring the, maybe get the queens traded off, and then eventually bring the king in, and just play for a good endgame with the bishops versus the rooks, which the rooks will not have any squares to cover. So, that's the long-range plan. But what I'm saying here is that black is clearly better here. So I can understand why white didn't want to go down this path, and he played bishop to e4. Now everything looks hunky-dory. Everything in the camp looks pretty well protected. I mean, the bishop's protecting the knight. The knight is protecting the bishop, as is the queen. So things look pretty tight. Black plays queen to h4. Now, up to this point, black has not invested any material, but he is at a point where such matters need to be considered. Now, Rotlewi played g3 here, but let's look at what happens after h3, because when I was first looking at this game, I thought this was the move to play, but black will sacrifice this rook, and after bishop takes rook, bishop takes e4. Now, if queen takes e4, Then we got queen to g3, threatens mate, so he's got to take the pawn, take the knight. And then queen to h4 is checkmate. A nice little pattern to remember. Let's look at it one more time. Queen to g3, and there's no way to stop the mate unless he takes the knight. And then this bishop's cutting off the escape square. This is pretty cool. So after bishop takes e4, probably the best shot is queen takes g4, but this doesn't work either because we do trade queens here. And after rook d3, we have to realize that there are some threats here. There's the threat of mate because of those powerful bishops. So king to h2, and then rook takes c3, and let's say after rook a c1, rook to c4, we get into a position which I was talking about earlier where black will probably drop the bishop here. He's got the threat of coming here, hitting the pawn and the rook, and if the rook trades, then this pawn's going to grab that. It'll be a pass pawn. The bishops will be incredibly strong in marshalling down that pass pawn, and falling short of that, if no trades are made, just bring the king into the center. And white's in very good shape here with the two pieces versus the rook, especially the strength of those bishops, undeniable. So that's what happens here after h3. It just doesn't work. Whoops, I wanted to go to the mating line here. I thought this was cuter. So none of those work. So he played g3 here. Now I remember looking at this, and of course I've seen the game before, but now I'm in an age of computers. Back in my day when I was learning the game, I didn't have computers. I had set them up on a board and moved the pieces around and look at all this stuff. But it's funny that it took Fritz 9, I can't remember how many, probably about 20 seconds or so to find the right move. But it took Deep Jr. just a nanosecond. It was there right away. Rubinstein now plays rook takes c3. What a tremendous move. This is a disruptive sacrifice, because this piece, which was guarding the bishop on e4, and it was guarding the queen, all of a sudden gets removed. Now we enter into a lot of complications here, and it's very amazing that Rubinstein's seen all this. So let's take a look at the alternatives. He played g takes h4 here, but let's look at the alternatives. Probably one of the first things to look at is going to be bishop takes bishop on b7. And then what happens after that? Give you a moment to look at this. I think probably rook takes g3. And so what's the threat here? There is no direct threat. Black is up a pawn. So rook a c1. And rook h3. Now there is a threat. Now rook to c2. I'm kind of wondering if knight f2 is best. No, I think probably, well, let's see. Let's see, what if queen g3? That looks interesting. No, probably knight f2 is okay. And the point is, after rook f2, bishop f2. Yeah, the thing is if queen takes f2, then we got rook to d1 check, and it's all over. It's not even worth going any further on that. So let's see, rook takes g3. Okay. Alright, is there anything else? Oh yeah, what about rook f3 here? And there's rook f3. Is that best? Rook f3. Bishop f3. Oh, again, we got knight f2. And now king to g1. Probably here putting the squeeze on with queen to h3 is good. Because we're threatening rook to d1. No, yeah. With discovered checks. Alright, I just think, alright. Black's up a pawn. He's got the white king terribly exposed. Do you need to find a win from this position? Yeah, probably, because the knight's kind of hanging there, but it's well protected. It's ensconced onto f2. So let's just take a... Let's try and get some counterplay going. Then you got knight to e4 check. Oh, here's a problem with that. I thought this was winning the queen, but it's actually mate. Let's see, does rook f1 help? We can play the same thing, can't we? Yeah, because if king over, it's mate. But you could play this. And so we just have the position we had before, and we're rook ahead. Okay. Alright, so bishop b7. Bishop takes bishop on b7 doesn't seem to do anything. How about if we try and eliminate this knight here, or get rid of that bishop in a different way with bishop f3? Well, that doesn't work either. We got this. f3. And now if he goes g takes h4, it'll continue on as in the game, but we're gonna see what happens, see if there's any other defense here. Oh, then we got rook check. Oh, this is over right away. Okay. Okay, so I don't see anything after bishop f3 that's helpful for white. So maybe g takes h4 is the way to go here, which is what was played in the game. But then we get a surprising move. Okay, just gave up a queen for a piece. And now, look at this. Four out of 5 of the black pieces say, oh my. 4 of black's 5 pieces are being attacked simultaneously. Isn't that amazing? Queen takes rook was played here. Let's see what other options there are. Well, first, before we go looking at options, let's see what the threat is here. So let's give white a non-move here. Let's look at this. The threat is bishop takes e4 check, and after queen takes, rook takes h2 as mate. Oops, sorry. So what happens after, we're going to look at queen takes rook, because that was the main line. What about bishop takes b7? Oh, then rook takes e2. And material's equal. Black's still got a rook hanging, but there's the mate threat, so he can't just take the rook. And if we go here, oh, this is a nice move. Got rook to h3. How cool is that? And now he could play, to stop the mate, he can block this diagonal to give the king a square to get to. But you just take it, and then black's up a rook. Because if bishop takes h3, it is still checkmate. Alright, if, let's see, bishop d4 doesn't do anything, yeah, after rook to h3, it's pretty much his goose is cooked. Alright, so bishop takes b7, doesn't work. And, let's see, moving the queen out of the way, can you move the queen anywhere? No, because of the instant mate threat if the queen moves off of the second rank. So, poor Rotlewi probably realized that things were pretty bad now, and he played queen takes d2. He could play... Sorry, let's look at this. What if he plays this here? Queen takes. Then we get bishop takes e4 check. Rook f3. Rook takes f3. And black's got material for this, you know, he's got equal material for what he sacrificed. And the attack hasn't been pushed back at all. So, for example, if like rook to g1, then we go rook to g3, and now, oh, this is so pretty. Because we have the discovered check here, and there's only one move. Well, there's two moves. You can drop the queen in, but look at this. And we checkmate in this way. Isn't that a pretty mate? Almost kind of wish he would have gone down that route now that I see that. But he played queen takes d2. And of course, bishop takes e4 check. Now after queen to g2, rook to h3. Now the queen is pinned, and she can't leave the second rank because she has to guard the h-pawn. But black has given up so much material. And since black has given up so much material, is there any way out for white by trying to return material? If he tries rook to f2, then we simply take the rook with the bishop. And now it's mate in two no matter what white does. You can't move the queen, it's pinned. So if he plays queen takes e4, then we got rook takes h2 mate. And then for any other piece move, let's just take any move. Doesn't really matter because they're all the same. They get the same answer. So as to f5. So if he played f5, or if he played rook to d1, or rook anywhere on the back rank, or the bishop anywhere, then the same result's going to happen. It's going to be rook takes pawn, checkmate. So very nice attack here in this position where Rubinstein played the very pretty rook takes c3. Just set everything as an avalanche falling down on white's position. And it's not easy to see all this because these are complications that are short in length, but there are so many of them. So many complications to look at. So many different move options. Even though they're not deep, they are wide, very wide. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that my explanation on the chess triad, material, space and time, and force was clear, and I hope it serves you in your own games in the future. Okay, until next time,